Off to a great start. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing with The Hunchback of Notre-Dame by Victor Hugo, starting with Part 1, Book 6, Chapter 5. But first, reading updates. I am listening to, I don't remember how far I am, but I am listening to A Darker Shade of Magic by V. Schwab. I'm enjoying it. I am more than halfway. I think I'm in like the 70% something, 60 something percent, something like that. But I am enjoying it. I am wondering, so it's book one of a trilogy, and I'm wondering at this point if we are going to get like the resolution or if the mission that they're on is going to span through the three books. I don't know. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. I guess I guess we'll find out. But I am enjoying it. I'm really enjoying V.E. Schwab's writing style. It's the first of her books that I have read, and I'm really liking the voice actor as well, who I forgot his first name, but last name is Crossley, Crossley. And yeah, I'm also reading Holly by Stephen King, and it is more crime than horror, even though it was rated for the top horror book on Goodreads 2023. I feel like it's just not in the right category. But it is really good. It's two different perspectives and in different timelines. We have a Holly who is a private investigator who has been hired by a mom whose daughter is missing. And then our other perspective is the kidnappers and murderers. And it's pretty great. It's pretty great. I'm enjoying it because you get like slice of life weirdness with the perpetrators, and then you get Holly and you're like, "Oh, you're so close. You're so close to figuring something out. Oh, you're interviewing this person? Okay, cool. Oh no, they forgot to tell you this one thing that is super important." So it's fun to like have that and just like know things that like the investigator doesn't, and you're just like rooting for her. So yeah, I am enjoying that as well. I'm hoping to finish this weekend. We will see. We'll see. So today we are reading The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. We are in part one, book sixth, chapter 5. And what happened last time? We actually got plot last time. Yes, we got a lot of architecture, but we have plot. And we have kind of intersecting stories, or like stories that don't seem like they tie in, and then Victor Hugo is like, I am a master, and then ties it in, which is really nice. So we have these three women who were gossiping back and forth, and this one woman was talking about why she is so scared of these vagabond Egyptian performers. And she talks about this one woman who has this nickname, which means beautiful flower song. And this woman had a cute little baby, and she doted on the baby so much, and the baby was just so beautiful, and cute little tiny feet and cute little tiny hands. And these travelers came through, and one of them was a soothsayer, and giving a lot of people very, very positive futures. I mean, like, you're going to be a queen, you're going to be rich, you are going to be, very successful in your craft, like all of these things. And so this woman is like, I'm going to take my beautiful little baby over there. And so she does. She gets the fortune that her baby is going to be very successful and very beautiful when she grows up. And she's so excited. She takes the baby home. She leaves the room to like go into the hallway or like hang out with the neighbors or whatever. She doesn't hear any noises. And then she hears just like this awful cry. And she runs in back into her room and sees that her baby is gone. And instead, there is a hideous monster baby. And so she runs out looking for her child and just crying and crying and everything. And rumor has it that she went into the river and drowned herself. And it's like, okay, well, what happened to this baby? Well, This baby had been exorcised by a priest and has been left outside of Notre-Dame as a foundling. And we learned that Claude Frollo is the person who took it upon himself to take in this baby, and the baby is actually Quasimodo, who is our bell ringer. And so these ladies are walking through the streets telling the story, and they are bringing this cake to this person who is in the rat hole, which is like a prison. And it turns out basically that this woman who is there is the woman in the story. Dun dun dun. And at the same time that all of this is happening, Quasimodo is on trial for what was perceived as him attacking and going to steal La Esmeralda. And Quasimodo is deaf from ringing the bells, and the auditor is deaf, and neither one of them really are like making it known that they're deaf. So it leads into this. It would be comical if it wasn't so tragic scene in which Quasimodo is actually sentenced to a heavier crime than what he originally would have been if they both weren't deaf, if they were both able to communicate in a better fashion. And so he is now being sentenced to 2 hours of public lashing. And so we do, unfortunately, also get that in this book. And he is just, Quasimodo being the he, is so thirsty and trying so hard not to make it into like a big scene or anything like that. And people are like laughing at him and throwing rocks at him and everything, and he's just like yelling for a drink, and people think that that's hilarious, and like an uproar happens, and La Esmeralda comes and brings like a gourd and gives him water or hydration. We don't, it could be water, it could be gourd juice, I really don't know. And yeah, and I think that was the last thing that happened. Question mark? I think so. I think so. And that's where we ended. So, let's get cozy. Let's get comfy. Let's get a sip of our water. Hydration. Let's do it. Chapter 5. End of the story of the cake. La Esmeralda turned pale and descended from the pillory, staggering as she went. The voice of the recluse still pursued her. Descend, descend, thief of Egypt, thou shalt ascend it once more. The sacked nun is in one of her tantrums, muttered the populace. And that was the end of it. For that sort of woman was feared, which rendered them sacred. People did not then willingly attack one who prayed day and night. The hour had arrived for removing Quasimodo. He was unbound. The crowd dispersed. Near the Grand Pont, Mariette, who was returning with her 2 companions, suddenly halted. By the way, Eustace, what did you do with that cake? Mother, said the child, while you were talking with that lady in the bowl, a big dog took a bite of my cake, and then I bit it also. What? Sir, did you eat the whole of it? She went on. Mother, it was the dog. I told him, but he would not listen to me. Then I bit it also. 'Tis a terrible child, said the mother, smiling, and scolding at one and the same time. Do you see, Odard? He already eats all the fruit from the cherry tree in our orchard of Chalarange. So his grandfather says that he will be a captain. Just let me catch you at it again, Mr. Eustace. Come along, you greedy fellow. End of the chapter. I feel like I should have read that last time. End of the chapter, and also end of the part. We are now entering part 2. Part 2, book 7th, chapter 1. The danger of confiding one's secret to a goat. Many weeks had elapsed. The 1st of March had arrived. The sun, with Dupartus, that classic ancestor of paraphrase, had not yet dubbed the Grand Duke of Candles, was none the less radiant and joyous on that account. It was one of those spring days which possesses so much sweetness and beauty that all Paris turns out into the squares and promenades and celebrates them as though they were Sundays. In those days of brilliancy, warmth, and serenity, there is a certain hour above all others when the facade of Notre-Dame should be admired. It is the moment when the sun, already declining towards the west, looks the cathedral almost full in the face. Its rays, growing more and more horizontal, withdraw slowly from the pavement of the square and mount up the perpendicular facade, whose thousand bosses in high relief they cause to start out from the shadows, while the great central rose window flames like the eye of a cyclops, inflamed with the reflections of the forge. This was the hour. Opposite the lofty cathedral, reddened by the setting sun, on the stone balcony built above the porch of a rich gothic house which formed the angle of the square and the Rue de Parvis, several young girls were laughing and chatting with every sort of grace and mirth. From the length of the veil which fell from their pointed coif, twined with pearls, to their heels, from the fineness of the embroidered chemisette, which covered their shoulders and allowed a glimpse, according to the pleasing custom of the time, of the swell of their fair virgin bosoms, from the opulence of their under petticoats, still more precious than their overdress, marvelous refinements, from the gauze, the silk, the velvet, with which all this was composed, and, above all, from the whiteness of their hands, which certified to their leisure and idleness, it was easy to define they were noble and wealthy heiresses. They were, in fact, Demoiselle Fleur de Lis of Grandelieu and her companions, Diane de Christieu, Ameliotte de Montmichel, Colombe de Gaillefontaine, and the little Champchevrier maiden, all damsels of good birth, assembled at this moment at the house of the dame widow of Gondelier, on account of Monseigneur de Beaujeu and Madame, his wife, who were to come to Paris in the month of April, there to choose maids of honor for the Dauphiness Marguerite, who was to be received in Picardy from the hands of the Flemings. Now, all the squires for 20 leagues around were intriguing for this favor for their daughters, and a goodly number of the latter had been already brought or sent to Paris. These 4 maidens had been confided to the discreet and venerable charge of Madame Eloise, widow of a former commander of the King's crossbowmen, who had retired with her only daughter to her house in the Place de Parvis, Notre-Dame, in Paris. The balcony on which these young girls stood opened from a chamber richly tapestried in fawn-colored Flanders leather, stamped with golden foliage. The beams, which cut the ceiling in parallel lines, diverted the eye with 1,000 eccentric painted and gilded carvings. Splendid enamels gleamed here and there on carved chests. A boar's head in faience crowned a magnificent dresser, whose 2 shelves announced that the mistress of the house was the wife or widow of a knight banneret. At the end of the room, by the side of a lofty chimney, blazoned with arms from top to bottom, in a rich red velvet armchair, sat Dame de Grandelieu, whose 55 years were written upon her garments no less distinctly than upon her face. Beside her stood a young man of imposing mien, although partaking somewhat of vanity and bravado, one of those handsome fellows whom all women agree to admire, although grave men learned in physiognomy shrug their shoulders at them. This young man wore the garb of a captain of the King's unattached archers, which bears far too much resemblance to the costume of Jupiter, which the reader has already been enabled to admire in the first book of this history, for us to inflict upon him a second description. The demoiselles were seated, apart in the chamber, apart in the balcony, some on square cushions of Utrecht velvet with golden corners, others on stools of oak carved in flowers and figures. Each of them held on her knee a section of a great needlework tapestry, on which they were working in company, while one end of it lay upon the rush mat which covered the floor. They were chatting together in that whispering tone, and with the half-stifled laughs peculiar to an assembly of young girls in whose midst there is a young man. The young man whose presence served to set in play all these feminine self-conceits appeared to pay very little heed to the matter, and while these pretty damsels were vying with one another to attract his attention, he seemed to be chiefly absorbed in polishing the buckle of his sword-belt with his dove-skin glove. From time to time, the old lady addressed him in a very low tone, and he replied as well as he was able, with a sort of awkward and constrained politeness. From the smiles and significant gestures of Dame Eloise, from the glances which she threw towards her daughter Fleur-de-Lis, as she spoke low to the captain, it was easy to see that there was here a question of some betrothal concluded, some marriage near at hand, no doubt, between the young man and Fleur-de-Lis. From the embarrassed coldness of the officer, it was easy to see that on his side, at least, love had no longer any part in the matter. His whole air was expressive of constraint and weariness, which our lieutenants of the garrison would today translate admirably as, "What a beastly bore." The poor dame, very much infatuated with her daughter, like any other silly mother, did not perceive the officer's lack of enthusiasm, and strove in low tones to call his attention to the infinite grace with which Fleur-de-Lis used her needle or wound her skein. "Come, little cousin," she said to him, plucking him by the sleeve in order to speak in his ear. "Look at her, do. See her stoop." "Yes, truly," replied the young man, and fell back into his glacial and absent-minded silence. A moment later he was obliged to bend down again, and Dame Eloise said to him, "Have you ever beheld a more happy and charming face than that of your betrothed? Can one be more white and blonde? Are not her hands perfect? And that neck, does it not assume all the curves of the swan in ravishing fashion? How I envy you at times, and how happy you are to be a man, naughty libertine that you are. Is not my Fleur-de-Lis adorably beautiful, and are you not desperately in love with her?" "Well, of course," he replied, still thinking of something else. "But do say something," said Madame Eloise, suddenly giving his shoulder a push. "You have grown very timid." We can assure our readers that timidity was neither the captain's virtue nor his defect, but he made an effort to do what was demanded of him. "Fair cousin," he said, approaching Fleur-de-Lis, "what is the subject of this tapestry work which you are fashioning?" "Fair cousin," responded Fleur-de-Lis in an offended tone, "I have already told you 3 times. 'Tis the grotto of Neptune." It was evident that Fleur-de-Lis saw much more clearly than her mother through the captain's cold and absent-minded manner. He felt the necessity of making some conversation. "And for whom is this Neptunery destined?" "For the Abbey of Saint Antoine de Champs," answered Fleur-de-Lis, without raising her eyes. The captain took up a corner of the tapestry. "Who, my fair cousin, is this big guardsman who is puffing out his cheeks to their full extent and blowing a trumpet?" "'Tis Triton," she replied. There was a rather pettish intonation in Fleur-de-Lis's laconic words, The young man understood that it was indispensable that he should whisper something in her ear, a commonplace, a gallant compliment, no matter what. Accordingly, he bent down, but he could find nothing in his imagination more tender and personal than this. "Why does your mother always wear that surcoat with armorial designs, like our grandmothers of the time of Charles VII? Tell her, fair cousin, that 'tis no longer the fashion, and that the hinge and the laurel embroidered on her robe give her the air of a walking mantelpiece. In truth, people no longer sit thus on their banners, I assure you." Fleur-de-lis raised her beautiful eyes, full of reproach. "Is that all of which you can assure me?" she said in a low voice. In the meantime, Dame Eloise, delighted to see them thus bending towards each other and whispering, said as she toyed with the clasps of her prayer book, "Touching picture of love." The captain, more and more embarrassed, fell back upon the subject of the tapestry. "'Tis, in sooth, a charming work," he exclaimed. Whereupon Colombe de Gallifontaine, another beautiful blonde, with a white skin, dressed to the neck in blue damask, ventured a timid remark which she addressed to Fleur-de-lis, in the hope that the handsome captain would reply to it. "My dear Grand Laurier, have you seen the tapestries of the Hotel de la Roche-Guyon? Is not that the hotel in which is enclosed the garden of the Landre de Louvre?" asked Diane, with a laugh, for she had handsome teeth and consequently laughed at every occasion. "And where there is that big old tower of the ancient wall of Paris," added Amelette, a pretty, fresh, and curly-headed brunette, who had a habit of sighing just as the other laughed, without knowing why. "My dear Colombe," interpolated Dame Eloise, "do you not mean the hotel which belonged to Monseigneur de Bocqueville in the reign of King Charles VI? There are indeed many superb high warp tapestries there." "Charles VI! Charles VI!" muttered the young captain, twirling his mustache. "Good heavens, what old things the old dame does remember!" Madame de Grandelaurier continued. "Fine tapestries, in truth, a work so esteemed that it passes as unrivaled." At that moment, Bérengère de Champchevrier, a slender little maid of 7 years, who was peering into the square through the trefoils of the balcony, exclaimed, "Look, fair godmother, Fleur-de-lis, at that pretty dancer who is dancing on the pavement and playing the tambourine in the midst of the loutish bourgeois." The sonorous vibration of a tambourine was, in fact, audible. Some performer from Bohemia," said Fleur-de-lis, turning carelessly towards the square. "Look, look!" exclaimed her lively companions, and they all ran to the edge of the balcony, while Fleur-de-lis, rendered thoughtful by the coldness of her betrothed, followed them slowly, and the latter, relieved by this incident, which put an end to an embarrassing conversation, retreated to the farther end of the room, with the satisfied air of a soldier released from duty. Nevertheless, the fair Fleur-de-lis was a charming and noble service, and such it had formerly appeared to him, but the captain had gradually become blasé. The prospect of a speedy marriage cooled him more every day. Moreover, he was of a fickle disposition, and, must we say it, rather vulgar in taste. Although of very noble birth, he had contracted in his official harness more than one habit of the common trooper. The tavern and its accompaniments pleased him. He was only at his ease amid gross language, military gallantries, facile beauties, and successes yet more easy. He had, nevertheless, received from his family some education and some politeness of manner. but he had been thrown on the world too young. He had been in garrison at too early an age, and every day the polish of a gentleman became more and more effaced by the rough friction of his guard's cross-belt. While still continuing to visit her from time to time, from a remnant of common respect, he felt doubly embarrassed with Fleur-de-Lis. In the first place, because, in consequence of having scattered his love in all sorts of places, he had reserved very little for her. In the next place, because, amid so many stiff, formal, and decent ladies, he was in constant fear lest his mouth, habituated to oaths, should suddenly take the bit in his teeth and break out into the language of the tavern. The effect can be imagined. Moreover, all this was mingled in him with great pretensions to elegance, toilette, and a fine appearance. Let the reader reconcile these things as best he can. I am simply the historian. He had remained, therefore, for several minutes, leaning in silence against the carved jamb of the chimney, and thinking or not thinking, when Fleur-de-Lis suddenly turned and addressed him. After all, the poor young girl was pouting against the dictates of her heart. "Fair cousin, did you not speak to us of a little Bohemian who you saved a couple of months ago, while making the patrol with the watch at night, from the hands of a dozen robbers?" "I believe so, fair cousin," said the captain. "Well," she resumed, "perchance 'tis the same young girl who is dancing yonder on the church square. Come and see if you recognize her, fair cousin Phoebus." A secret desire for reconciliation was apparent in this gentle invitation which she gave him to approach her, and in the care which she took to call him by name, Captain Phoebus de Chateaupers, for it is he whom the reader has had before his eyes since the beginning of this chapter, slowly approached the balcony. "Stay," said Fleur-de-Lis, laying her hand tenderly on Phoebus's arm. "Look at that young girl yonder, dancing in that square. Is she your Bohemian?" Phoebus looked and said, "Yes, I recognize her by her goat." "Oh, in fact, what a pretty little goat!" said Amelot, clasping her hands in admiration. "Are his horns of real gold?" inquired Beranger. Without moving from her armchair, Dame Eloise interposed. Is she not one of those traveling girls who arrived last year by the Gibbert gate?" "Oh, madam, my mother," said Fleur-de-Lis gently, "that gate is now called the Porte d'Enfer." Mademoiselle de Grandelieu knew how her mother's antiquated mode of speech shocked the captain. In fact, he began to sneer, and muttered between his teeth, "Port Gibbard, Port Gibbard, 'tis enough to make King Charles VI pass by." "Godmother," exclaimed the young girl, whose eyes, incessantly in motion, had suddenly been raised to the summit of the towers of Notre-Dame, who is that man up yonder?" All the young girls raised their eyes. A man was, in truth, leaning on the balustrade which surmounted the northern tower, looking on the Grève. He was a priest. His costume could be plainly discerned, and his face resting on both his hands. But he stirred no more than if he had been a statue. His eyes, intently fixed, gazed into the place. It was something like the immobility of a bird of prey who has just discovered a nest of sparrows and is gazing at it. "'Tis Monsieur the Archdeacon of Justice," said Fleur-de-Lis. "You have good eyes if you can recognize him from here," said the Gallifontaine. "How he is staring at that little dancer," went on Diane. "Let the performer beware," said Fleur-de-Lis, "for he loves not Egypt." "'Tis a great shame for that man to look upon her thus," added Amelette, for she dances delightfully." "Fair cousin Phoebus," said Fleur-de-Lis suddenly, "since you know this little girl, make her a sign to come up here. It will amuse us." "Oh, yes," exclaimed all the young girls, clapping their hands. "Why, 'tis not worth while," replied Phoebus. "She has forgotten me, no doubt, and I know not so much as her name. Nevertheless, as you wish it, young ladies, I will make the trial." And leaning over the balustrade of the balcony, he began to shout, "Little one!" The dancer was not beating her tambourine at that moment. She turned her head towards the point whence this call proceeded. Her brilliant eyes rested on Phoebus, and she stopped short. "Little one," repeated the captain, and he beckoned her to approach. The young girl looked at him again. Then she blushed, as though a flame had mounted into her cheeks, and, taking her tambourine under her arm, she made her way through the astonished spectators towards the door of the house where Phoebus was calling her, with slow, tottering steps, and with the troubled look of a bird which is yielding to the fascination of a serpent. A moment later, the tapestry portière was raised, and the performer appeared on the threshold of the chamber, blushing, confused, breathless, her large eyes drooping, and not daring to advance another step. Berengaire clapped her hands. Meanwhile, the dancer remained motionless upon the threshold. Her appearance had produced a singular effect upon these young girls. It is certain that a vague and indistinct desire to please the handsome officer animated them all, that his splendid uniform was the target of all their coquetries, and that from the moment he presented himself, there existed among them a secret, suppressed rivalry, which they hardly acknowledged even to themselves, but which broke forth, none the less, every instant in their gestures and remarks. Nevertheless, as they were all very nearly equal in beauty, they contended with equal arms, and each could hope for the victory. The arrival of the dancer suddenly destroyed this equilibrium. Her beauty was so rare that, at the moment when she appeared at the entrance of the apartment, it seemed as though she diffused a sort of light which was peculiar to herself. In that narrow chamber, surrounded by that sombre frame of hangings and woodwork, she was incomparably more beautiful and more radiant than on the public square. She was like a torch which has suddenly been brought from broad daylight into the dark. The noble damsels were dazzled by her in spite of themselves. Each one felt herself, in some sort, wounded by her beauty. Hence, their battle-front, may we be allowed the expression, was immediately altered, although they exchanged not a single word, but they understood each other perfectly. Women's instincts comprehend and respond to each other more quickly than the intelligences of men. An enemy had just arrived. All felt it. All rallied together. One drop of wine is sufficient to tinge a glass of water red, to diffuse a certain degree of ill temper throughout a whole assembly of pretty women. The arrival of a prettier woman suffices, especially when there is but one man present. Hence the welcome accorded to the Egyptian girl was marvelously glacial. They surveyed her from head to foot, then exchanged glances, and all was said. They understood each other. Meanwhile, the young girl was waiting to be spoken to, in such emotion that she dared not raise her eyelids. The captain was the first to break the silence. "Upon my word," said he, in his tone of intrepid fatuity, "here is a charming creature. What think you of her, fair cousin?" This remark, which a more delicate admirer would have uttered in a lower tone, at least was not of a nature to dissipate the feminine jealousies which were on the alert before this stranger. Fleur-de-Lis replied to the captain with a bland affectation of disdain. "Not bad." The others whispered. At length, Madame Eloise, who was not the least jealous because she was so for her daughter, addressed the dancer. Approach, little one. Approach, little one, repeated with comical dignity little Berengar, who would have reached about as high as her hips. The young Egyptian girl advanced towards the noble dame. "Fair child," said Phoebus with emphasis, taking several steps towards her, "I do not know whether I have the supreme honor of being recognized by you." She interrupted him with a smile and a look full of infinite sweetness. "Oh, yes," said she. "She has a good memory," remarked Fleur-de-Lis. "Come, now," resumed Phoebus. "You escaped nimbly the other evening. Did I frighten you?" "Oh, no," said the stranger. There was in the intonation of that "oh, no," uttered after that "oh, yes," an ineffable something which wounded Fleur-de-Lis. "You left me in your stead, my beauty," pursued the captain, whose tongue was unloosed when speaking to a girl out of the street, "a crabbed knave, one-eyed and hunchbacked, the bishop's bell-ringer, I believe. I have been told that by birth he is the bastard of an archdeacon and a devil. He has a pleasant name. He is called Quatre-Temps, Pâques-Fleuries, Mardi Gras, I know not what, the name of some festival when the bells are pealed. So he took the liberty of carrying you off, as though you were made of beetles. 'Tis too much. What the devil did that screech owl want with you? Hey, tell me." "Well, I do not know," she replied. "The inconceivable imprudence! A bell-ringer carrying off a wench, like a vicomte. A lout poaching on the game of gentlemen. That is a rare piece of assurance. However, he paid dearly for it. Master Pierre Torterue is the harshest groom that ever curried a knave, and I can tell you, if it will be agreeable to you, that your bell-ringer's hide got a thorough dressing at his hands." "Oh, poor man," said the young girl, in whom these words revived the memory of the pillory. The captain burst out laughing. "Corne de boeuf, here's a pity as well placed as a feather in a pig's tail. May I have as big a belly as a pope if—" He stopped short. "Pardon me, ladies. I believe that I was on the point of saying something foolish." "Fie, sir," said Laguafontaine. "Oh, he talks to that creature in her own tongue," added Fleur-de-Lis in a low tone, her irritation increasing every moment. This irritation was not diminished when she beheld the captain, enchanted with this young performer, and, most of all, with himself, execute a pirouette on his heel, repeating the coarse, naive, and soldierly gallantry. A handsome wench, upon my soul." "Rather savagely dressed," said Diana, laughing to show her fine teeth. This remark was a flash of light to the others. Not being able to impugn her beauty, they attacked her costume. "That is true," said La Montmichel. "What makes you run about the streets thus, without ruff?" "That petticoat is so short that it makes one tremble," added Laguafontaine. "My dear," continued Fleur-de-Lis with decided sharpness, "you will get yourself taken up by the sumptuary police for your gilded girdle." Little one," resumed Locristio, with an implacable smile, "if you were to put respectable sleeves upon your arms, they would get less sunburned." It was, in truth, a spectacle worthy of a more intelligent spectator than Phoebus, to see how these beautiful maidens, with their envenomed and angry tongues, wound, serpent-like, and glided and writhed around the street dancer. They were cruel and graceful. They searched and rummaged maliciously in her poor and silly toilet of spangles and tinsel. There was no end to their laughter, irony, and humiliation. Sarcasms rained down upon me, and haughty condescension, and malevolent looks. One would have thought they were young Roman dames thrusting golden pins into the breast of a beautiful slave. One would have pronounced them elegant greyhounds, circling with inflated nostrils round a poor woodland fawn whom the glance of their master forbade them to devour. After all, what was a miserable dancer on the public squares in the presence of these high-born maidens? They seemed to take no heed of her presence, and talked of her aloud, to her face, as of something unclean, abject, and yet, at the same time, passably pretty. The young girl was not insensible to these pinpricks. From time to time a flush of shame, a flash of anger inflamed her eyes or her cheeks. With disdain she made that little grimace with which the reader is already familiar, but she remained motionless. She fixed on Phoebus a sad, sweet, resigned look. There was also happiness and tenderness in that gaze. One would have said that she endured for fear of being expelled. Phoebus laughed, and took the young girl's part with a mixture of impertinence and pity. "Let them talk, little one," he repeated, jingling his golden spurs. "No doubt your toilet is a little extravagant and wild, but what difference does that make with such a charming damsel as yourself?" "Oh, good gracious!" exclaimed the blonde Gallifontaine, drawing up her swan-like throat with a bitter smile. "I see that messieurs, the archers, have the king's police easily take fire at the handsome eyes of this performer." "Why not?" said Phoebus. At this reply, uttered carelessly by the captain, like a stray stone whose fall one does not watch, Colombe began to laugh, as well as Diane, Amelot, and Fleur-de-Lis, into whose eyes at the same time a tear started. The young performer, who had dropped her eyes on the floor at the words of Colombe de Gallifontaine, raised them beaming with joy and pride, and fixed them once more on Phoebus. She was very beautiful at that moment. The old dame, who was watching this scene, felt offended, without understanding why. "Holy Virgin!" she suddenly exclaimed. "What is it moving about my legs? Oh, the villainous beast!" It was the goat, who had just arrived, in search of his mistress, and who, in dashing towards the latter, had begun by entangling his horns in the pile of stuffs which the noble dame's garments heaped on her feet when she was seated. This creature a diversion, the young performer disentangled his horns without uttering a word. "Oh, there's the little goat with golden hooves!" exclaimed Berengar, dancing with joy. The street performer crouched down on her knees and leaned her cheek against the fondling head of the goat. One would have said that she was asking pardon for having quitted it thus. Meanwhile, Diane had bent down to Colombe's ear. "Oh, good heavens! Why did not I think of that sooner? 'Tis this street performer with the goat. They say she is a sorceress, and that her goat executes very miraculous tricks." "Well," said Colombe, "that ghost must now amuse us in its turn, and perform a miracle for us." Diane and Colombe eagerly addressed this street performer. "Little one, make your goat perform a miracle." "Oh, I do not know what you mean," replied the dancer. "A miracle, a piece of magic, a bit of sorcery, in short." "I do not understand." And she fell to caressing the pretty animal, repeating, "Jolly, jolly." At that moment Fleur-de-Lis noticed a little bag of embroidered leather suspended from the neck of the goat. "What is that?" she asked the Egyptian girl. She raised her large eyes upon her and replied gravely, "That is my secret." I should really like to know what your secret is, thought Fleur-de-Lis. Meanwhile, the good dame had risen angrily. Come now, performer, if neither you nor your goat can dance for us, what are you doing here? The dancer looked. The dancer walked slowly towards the door without making any reply, but the nearer she approached it, the more her pace slackened. An irresistible magnet seemed to hold her. Suddenly, she turned her eyes, wet with tears, towards Phoebus, and halted. True God, exclaimed the captain, that's not the way to depart. Come back and dance something for us. By the way, my sweet love, what is your name? La Esmeralda, said the dancer, never taking her eyes from him. At this strange name, a burst of wild laughter broke from the young girls. Here's a terrible name for a young lady, said Diane. You see well enough, retorted Amelot, that she is an enchantress. My dear, exclaimed Dame Eloise solemnly, your parents did not commit the sin of giving you that name at the baptismal font. In the meantime, several minutes previously, Berengar had coaxed the goat into a corner of the room with a marchpane cake, without anyone having noticed her. In an instant, they had become good friends. The curious child had detached the bag from the goat's neck and opened it, and had emptied out its contents on the rush matting. It was an alphabet, each letter of which was separately inscribed on the tiny block of boxwood. Hardly had these playthings been spread out on the matting when the child, with surprise, beheld the goat. One of those miracles, this was, no doubt. Drawn out certain letters with its golden hoof, and arranged them with single pushes in a certain order. In a moment they constituted a word, which the goat seemed to have been trained to write. So little hesitation did it show in forming it, that Berengar suddenly exclaimed, clasping her hands in admiration, Godmother Fleur-de-Lis, see what the goat has just done. Fleur-de-Lis ran up and trembled. The letters arranged upon the floor formed this word, Phoebus. Why, was it the goat who wrote that? She inquired in a changed voice. Yes, godmother, said Berengar. It was impossible to doubt it. The child did not know how to write. This is the secret, thought Fleur-de-Lis. Meanwhile, at the child's exclamation, all had hastened up, the mother, the young girls, the street dancer, and the officer. La Esmeralda beheld the piece of folly which the goat had committed. She turned red, then pale, and began to tremble like a culprit before the captain, who gazed at her with a smile of satisfaction and amazement. Phoebus, whispered the young girls, stupefied. 'Tis the captain's name. You have a marvelous memory, said Fleur-de-Lis to the petrified street dancer, then burst into sobs. Oh, she stammered mournfully, hiding her face in both her beautiful hands. She is a magician. And she heard another, and a still more bitter voice at the bottom of her heart saying, She is a rival. She fell fainting. My daughter, cried the terrified mother. Begone, you street dancer of hell. In a twinkling, La Esmeralda gathered up the unlucky letters, made a sign to her goat, and went out through one door, while Fleur-de-Lis was being carried out through the other. Captain Phoebus, on being left alone, hesitated for a moment between the two doors, and then followed the young Egyptian. End of chapter 1. So we got a super, super short chapter, and then this one is like, oh, let me make up for it. Okay, so in this chapter, we have seemingly, again, characters who are unrelated to the actual story. We have 4 younger ladies and a girl of 7, as well as a mother of one of them. And they're all just talking, and there is, a cousin who is the head of the guard, and he's just kind of disinterested. And the women here don't really interested interest him. He's more interested in being at the tavern and being amongst the women who hang out at the tavern. And also, he doesn't really like talking properly either. And so he doesn't really feel comfortable or really want to be there. And so they're talking back and forth. He apparently is supposed to be married to his cousin, which is a thing that happens far too often. But he's supposed to be married to his cousin, Fleur de Lis, and she is beautiful. They're all beautiful. And like she's working on some crosswork. He pretends to be interested in it, and she just goes along with it, knowing that he's not really interested in it. And then outside, the youngest, the 7-year-old, sees as who happens to be Esmeralda, who we later find out, but she's dancing with her tambourine, and Fleur de Lis is like, "Oh, didn't you like save a street performer the other night?" And Phoebus is like, "Yeah, I did." And so he goes over to the window. He sees that it is her, and they're like, "Call her up, make her to perform for us. I hear that she works with the devil." And so he does call her up. She comes up, and they're asking her questions and kind of mocking. And in the lighting, when they get closer to her, they also see that she's just so, so beautiful. And they feel threatened by this beauty, which I hate that. I hate that so much. But they feel threatened, and so instead of, welcoming her in or being nice, they're sort of picking her apart by what she's wearing. And then they pick apart her name. They're like, "Oh, your mother did a horrible job. This is a terrible name for you." Blah, blah, blah. And her goat's there. The youngest girl is so excited about this little goat. There's a little bag around the goat's neck, and it's asked about this, and La Esmeralda is like, that's my secret. And so the little girl like brings the goat over as like the ladies are being mean, and is playing with the little goat. She does open the little bag, and there's a bunch of little letters, and the goat spells out Phoebus. And so the women see this, they're like, excuse me? And they make they make her leave. They make Esmeralda leave. And that is oh, and then Phoebus is like, should I stay with these people that I don't really like or care about? No. And so he leaves. And that's where that chapter ended. All right. Chapter 2. A priest and a philosopher are two different things. The priest, whom the young girls had observed at the top of the north tower, leaning over the place and so attentive to the dance of our street performer, was, in fact, Archdeacon Claude Frollo. Our readers have not forgotten the mysterious cell which the Archdeacon had reserved for himself in that tower. I do not know, by the way, be it said, whether it be not the same, the interior of which can be seen today through the little square window, opening to the east at the height of a man above the platform from which the tower springs. A bare and dilapidated den, whose badly plastered walls are ornamented here and there at the present day, with some wretched yellow engravings representing the facades of cathedrals. I presume that this hole is jointly inhabited by bats and spiders, and that, consequently, it wages a double war of extermination on the flies. Every day, an hour before sunset, the Archdeacon ascended the staircase to the tower and shut himself up in this cell, where he sometimes passed whole nights. That day, at the moment when, standing before the low door of his retreat, he was fitting into the lock the complicated little key which he always carried about him in the purse suspended to his side, a sound of tambourine and castanets had reached his ear. These sounds came from the Place du Parvis. The cell, as we have already said, had only one window, opening upon the rear of the church. Claude Frollo had hastily withdrawn the key, and an instant later he was on the top of the tower, in the gloomy and pensive attitude in which the maidens had seen him. There he stood, grave, motionless, absorbed in one look and one thought. All Paris lay at his feet, with 1,000 spires of its edifices, and its circular horizon of gentle hills, with its river winding under its bridges, and its people moving to and fro through its streets, with the clouds of its smoke, with the mountainous chain of its roofs which presses Notre-Dame in its doubled folds. But out of all the city, the archdeacon gazed at one corner only of the pavement, Place du Parvis, in all that throng at but one figure, the street dancer. It would have been difficult to say what was the nature of this look, and whence proceeded the flame that flashed from it. It was a fixed gaze which was, nevertheless, full of trouble and tumult, and, from the profound immobility of his whole body, barely agitated at intervals by an involuntary shiver, as a tree is moved by the wind, from the stiffness of his elbows, more marble than the balustrade on which they leaned, or the sight of the petrified smile which contracted his face. One would have said that nothing living was left about Claude Frollo except his eyes. The performer was dancing. She was twirling her tambourine on the tip of her finger and tossing it into the air as she danced provincial sarabands, agile, light, joyous, and unconscious of the formidable gaze which descended perpendicularly upon her head. The crowd was swarming around her. From time to time, a man accoutred in red and yellow made them form into a circle, and then returned, seated himself on a chair a few paces from the dancer, and took the goat's head on his knees. This man seemed to be the young Egyptian's companion. Claude Frollo could not distinguish his features from his elevated post. From the moment when the archdeacon caught sight of this stranger, his attention seemed divided between him and the dancer, and his face became more and more gloomy. All at once he rose upright, and a quiver ran through his whole body. "Who is that man?" he muttered between his teeth. "I have always seen her alone before." Then he plunged down beneath the tortuous vault of the spiral staircase, and once more descended. As he passed the door of a bell-chamber, which was ajar, he saw something which struck him. He beheld Quasimodo, who, leaning through an opening of one of those slate penthouses which resemble enormous blinds, appeared also to be gazing at the place. He was engaged in so profound a contemplation that he did not notice the passage of his adopted father. His savage eye had a singular expression. It was a charmed, tender look. "This is strange," muttered Claude. "Is it the performer at whom he is gazing?" He continued his descent. At the end of a few minutes, the anxious archdeacon entered upon the place from the door at the base of the tower. "What has become of this girl?" he said, mingling with the group of spectators which the sound of the tambourine had collected.
"I know not," replied one of his neighbors. "I think that she had gone to some of her fandangos in the opposite house, whither they have called her."
In the place of the performer, on the carpet, whose arabesques had seemed to vanish but a moment previously by the capricious figures of her dance, the archdeacon no longer beheld anyone but the red and yellow man, who, in order to earn a few testers in his turn, was walking round the circle, with his elbows on his hips, his head thrown back, his face red, his neck outstretched, with a chair between his teeth. To the chair he had fastened a cat, which a neighbor had lent, and which was spitting in great affright. "Notre-Dame!" exclaimed the archdeacon, at the moment when the juggler, perspiring heavily, passed in front of him with his pyramid of chair and his cat. "What is Master Pierre Gringoire doing here?" The harsh voice of the Archdeacon threw the poor fellow into such a commotion that he lost his equilibrium, together with his whole edifice, and the chair and the cat tumbled pell-mell upon the heads of the spectators, in the midst of inextinguishable hootings. It is probable that Master Pierre Gringoire, for it was indeed he, would have had a sorry account to settle with the neighbor who owned the cat, and all the bruised and scratched faces which surrounded him, if he had not hastened to profit by the tumult to take refuge in the church, whither Claude Frollo had made him a sign to follow him. The cathedral was already dark and deserted. The side aisles were full of shadows, and the lamps of the chapels began to shine out like stars, so black had the vaulted ceiling become. Only the great rose window of the facade, whose thousand colors were steeped in a ray of horizontal sunlight, glittered in the gloom like a mass of diamonds, and threw its dazzling reflection to the other end of the nave. When they had advanced a few paces, Dom Claude placed his back against a pillar and gazed intently at Gringoire. The gaze was not the one which Gringoire feared, ashamed as he was of having been caught by a grave and learned person in the costume of a buffoon. There was nothing mocking or ironical in the priest's glance. It was serious, tranquil, piercing. The Archdeacon was the first to break the silence. "Come now, Master Pierre. You are to explain many things to me. The first of all, how comes it that you have not been seen for 2 months, and that now one finds you in the public squares in a fine equipment in truth, motley red and yellow, like a caudebec apple?" "Monsieur," said Gringoire piteously, "it is, in fact, an amazing accoutrement. You see me no more comfortable in it than a cat coiffed with a calabash. 'Tis very ill done, I am conscious, to expose monsieur the sergeants of the watch to the liability of cudgelling beneath this cassock the humerus of the Pythagorean philosopher. But what would you have, my reverend master? 'Tis the fault of my ancient jerkin which abandoned me in cowardly wise at the beginning of the winter, under the pretext that it was falling into tatters, and that it required repose in the basket of a rag-picker. What is one to do? Civilization has not yet arrived at the point where one can go stark naked, as ancient Diogenes would have wished. Add that a very cold wind was blowing, and 'tis not in the month of January that one can successfully attempt to make humanity take this new step. This garment presented itself. I took it, and I left my ancient black smock, which, for a hermetic like myself, was far from being hermetically closed. Behold me, then, in the garments of a stage player, like Saint Genest. What would you have? 'Tis an eclipse. Apollo himself tended the flocks of Admetus. "'Tis a fine profession that you are engaged in," replied the Archdeacon. "I agree, my master, that 'tis better to philosophize and poetize, to blow the flame in the furnace, or to receive it from Carrie Cats on a shield. So when you addressed me, I was as foolish as an ass before a turnspit. But what would you have, monsieur? One must eat every day, and the finest Alexandrine verses are not worth a bit of brie cheese. Now, I made for Madame Marguerite of Flanders that famous epithalamium, as you know. The city will not pay me, under the pretext that it was not excellent, as though one could give a tragedy of Sophocles for 4 crowns. Hence, I was on the point of dying with hunger. Happily, I found that I was rather strong in the jaw, so I said to this jaw, perform some feats of strength and of equilibrium. Nourish thyself. E te ipsum. A pack of beggars who have become my good friends have taught me 20 sorts of Herculean feats, and now I give to my teeth every evening the bread which they have earned during the day by the sweat of my brow. After all, concedo, I grant that it is a sad employment for my intellectual faculties, and that man is not made to pass his life in beating the tambourine and biting the chairs. But, reverend master, It is not sufficient to pass one's life. One must earn the means for life. Dom Claude listened in silence. All at once his deep-set eyes assumed so sagacious and penetrating an expression that Gringoire himself felt himself, so to speak, searched to the bottom of the soul by that glance. Very good, Master Pierre. But how comes it that you are now in company with that street dancer? In faith, said Gringoire, 'tis because she is my wife, and I am her husband. The priest's gloomy eyes flashed into flame. Have you done that, you wretch? He cried, seizing Gringoire's arm with fury. Have you been so abandoned by God as to raise your hand against that girl? On my chance of paradise, Monseigneur, replied Gringoire, trembling in every limb, I swear to you that I have never touched her, if that is what disturbs you. Then why do you talk of husband and wife? Said the priest. Gringoire made haste to relate to him as succinctly as possible all that the reader already knows. His adventure in the Court of Miracles, and the broken crock marriage. It appeared, moreover, that this marriage had led to no result whatever, and that each evening the street performer cheated him of his nuptial right as on the first day. "'Tis a mortification," he said in conclusion, "but that is because I have had the misfortune to wed a virgin." "What do you mean?" demanded the archdeacon, who had been gradually appeased by this recital. "'Tis very difficult to explain," replied the poet. "It is a superstition. My wife is, according to what an old thief, who is called among us the Duke of Egypt, has told me, a foundling or a lost child, which is the same thing. She wears on her neck an amulet which, it is affirmed, will cause her to meet her parents some day, but which will lose its virtue if the young girl loses hers. Hence it follows that both of us remain very virtuous." "So," resumed Claude, whose brow cleared more and more, "you believe, Master Pierre, that this creature has not been approached by any man?" "What would you have a man do, Dom Claude, as against a superstition? She has got that in her head. I assuredly esteem as a rarity this nun-like prudery, which is preserved untamed amid those Bohemian girls who are so easily brought into subjection. But she has three things to protect her: the Duke of Egypt, who has taken her under his safeguard, reckoning, perchance, on selling her to some abbey; all his tribe, who hold her in singular veneration, like a Notre-Dame; and a certain tiny poniard, which the buxom dame always wears about her, in some nook, in spite of the ordinances of the provost, and which one causes to fly out into her hands by squeezing her waist. 'Tis a proud wasp, I can tell you." The archdeacon pressed Gringoire with questions. La Esmeralda, in the judgment of Gringoire, was an inoffensible and charming creature, pretty, with the exception of a pout which was peculiar to her. A naive and passionate damsel, ignorant of everything and enthusiastic about everything, not yet aware of the difference between a man and a woman, even in her dreams, made like that, wild, especially over dancing, noise, the open air, a sort of woman bee with invisible wings on her feet, and living in a whirlwind. She owed this nature to the wandering life which she had always led. Gringoire had succeeded in learning that, while a mere child, she had traversed Spain and Catalonia, even to Sicily. He believed that she had been taken by the caravan of Zingari, of which she formed a part, to the kingdom of Algiers, a country situated in Achaia, which country adjoins on one side Albania and Greece, on the other the Sicilian Sea, which is the road to Constantinople. The Bohemians, said Gringoire, were vassals of the king of Algiers, in his quality of chief of the white Moors. One thing is certain, that La Esmeralda has come to France while still very young, by way of Hungary. From all these countries the young girl had brought back fragments of odd jargons, songs, and strange ideas, which made her language as motley as her costume, half Parisian, half African. However, the people of the quarters which she frequented loved her for her gaiety, her daintiness, her lively manners, her dances, and her songs. She believed herself to be hated in all the city by but two persons, of whom she often spoke in terror: the sacked nun of the Tour Roland, a villainous recluse who cherished some secret grudge against these performers, and who cursed the poor dancer every time that the latter passed before her window, and a priest who never met her without casting at her looks and words which frightened her. The mention of this last circumstance disturbed the Archdeacon greatly, though Gringoire paid no attention to his perturbation. To such an extent had 2 months sufficed to cause the heedless poet to forget the singular details of the evening on which he had met, and the presence of the Archdeacon in it all. Otherwise, the little dancer feared nothing. She did not tell fortunes which protected her against those trials for magic which were so frequently instituted against Egyptian women. And then Gringoire held the position of her brother, if not of her husband. After all, the philosopher endured this sort of platonic marriage very patiently. It meant a shelter, and bread, at least. Every morning he set out from the lair of the thieves, generally with this Bohemian. He helped her make her collections of targes and little blanks in the squares. Each evening he returned to the same roof with her, allowed her to bolt herself into her little chamber, and slept the sleep of the just. A very sweet existence, taking it all in all, he said, and well adapted to reverie. And then, on his soul and conscience, the philosopher was not very sure that he was madly in love with this young girl. He loved her goat almost as dearly. It was a charming animal, gentle, intelligent, clever, a learned goat. Nothing was more common in the Middle Ages than those learned animals, which amazed people greatly, and often led their instructors to the stake. But the witchcraft of the goat with the golden hoofs was a very innocent species of magic. Gringoire explained them to the Archdeacon, whom these details seemed to interest deeply. In the majority of cases it was sufficient to present the tambourine to the goat in such or such a manner, in order to obtain from him the trick desired. He had been trained to this by the Bohemian, who possessed, in these delicate arts, so rare a talent that 2 months had sufficed to teach the goat to write, with movable letters, the word Phoebus. "Phoebus," said the priest. "Why Phoebus?" "I know not," replied Gringoire. "Perhaps it is a word that which she believes to be endowed with some magic and secret virtue. She often repeats it in a low tone when she thinks that she is alone." "Are you sure," persisted Claude, with his penetrating glance, "that it is only a word, and not a name?" "The name of whom?" said the poet. "How should I know?" said the priest. "This is what I imagine, monsieur. These Bohemians are something like goobers, and adore the sun. Hence, Phoebus." "That does not seem clear to me as to you, Master Pierre." "After all, that does not concern me. Let her mumble her Phoebus at her pleasure. One thing is certain, that Jolly loves me almost as much as he does her." "Who is Jolly?" "The goat." The Archdeacon dropped his chin into his hand, and appeared to reflect for a moment. All at once he turned abruptly to Gringoire once more. "And do you swear to me that you have not touched her?" "Whom?" said Gringoire. "The goat?" "No, the woman." "My wife? I swear to you that I have not." "You are often alone with her?" "A good hour every evening." Don Claude frowned. Oh, solus cum sola non cagibuntur, or our paternoster." Upon my soul I could say the Pater, and the Ave Maria, and the Credo in Deum Patrum Omnipotentum, without her paying any more attention to me than a chicken to a church. Swear to me by the body of your mother, repeated the Archdeacon violently, that you have not touched that creature even with the tip of your finger. I will also swear it by the head of my father, for the two things have more affinity between them. But, my reverend master, permit me a question in my turn. Speak, sir. What concern is it of yours? The Archdeacon's pale face became as crimson as the cheek of the young girl. He remained for a moment without answering. Then, with visible embarrassment, Listen, Master Pierre Gringoire. You are not yet damned, so far as I know. I take an interest in you, and wish you well. Now the least contact with that Egyptian of the demon would make you the vassal of Satan. You know that 'tis always the body which ruins the soul. Woe to you if you approach that woman. That is all. I tried once, said Gringoire, scratching his ear. It was the first day, but I got stung. You were so audacious, Master Pierre. And the priest's brow clouded over again. On another occasion, continued the poet with a smile, I peeped through the keyhole before going to bed, and I beheld the most delicious dame in her shift that ever made a bed creak under her bare foot. Go to the devil, cried the priest with a terrible look, and giving the amazed Gringoire a push on the shoulders, he plunged with long strides under the gloomiest arcades of the cathedral. End of chapter 2. All right, chapter 2, we have Claude, Archdeacon Claude, watching from above La Esmeralda performing, and it is just a terrible sight to see. How dare she? But this time she has a male companion with her, and he's never seen that before. He's never seen her with another person. And so he's a little curious. He goes down there and she's gone. But what he does see is that there's this guy performing with like a chair and a cat and his teeth. He's doing something. He's doing something mystical. And he realizes that it's Gringoire. Gringoire, we met a long time ago. He is the one who was the director of the performance that was supposed to be happening, but was derailed basically by the Feast of Fools and all of the royals arriving. And so like this is now his life. He is married to Esmeralda, as we know, for 4 years because of the pot shattering, and um Claude is like, yeah, I know who you are. What has happened to you, and what are you wearing? And so uh, Gringoire explains everything. He's like, yeah, like, we're married 4 years, blah, blah, blah. I am now, like, a performer. Like, I do these things. Like, she taught me how to do these. Like, I hang out with her goat. Her goat is awesome, which I expect nothing less. And Claude is like, well, your soul, though. She is clearly working with the devil and your soul. And Gringoire is like, yeah, I've never touched her. Like, she won't let me. And Claude just doesn't really believe him. And so he's like, no, there's like a superstition. Like, she has this amulet and she can only be reunited with her family if she wears the amulet and if she stays pure. So Claude is like, right, but like, are you sure? And Gringoire's like, yeah, I tried and it didn't work. And then once I like looked through this little keyhole and I saw her and she was great. And then that just like infuriates Claude and he just like storms away. And that's where the chapter ended. A good old storm away. My heavens. All right, onward. Oops. Chapter 3. The Bells. After the morning in the pillory, the neighbors of Notre-Dame thought they noticed that Quasimodo's ardor for ringing had grown cool. Formerly, there had been peals for every occasion. long morning serenades, which lasted from prime to compline, peals from the belfry for a high mass, rich scales drawn over the smaller bells for a wedding, for a christening, and mingling in the air like a rich embroidery of all sorts of charming sounds. The old church, all vibrating and sonorous, was in a perpetual joy of bells. One was constantly conscious of the presence of a spirit of noise and caprice, who sang through all those mouths of brass. Now that spirit seemed to have departed. The cathedral seemed gloomy and gladly remained silent. Festivals and funerals had the simple peal, dry and bare, demanded by the ritual, nothing more. Of the double noise which constitutes a church, the organ within, the bell without, but the organ remained alone. One would have said that there was no longer a musician in the belfry. Quasimodo was always there, nevertheless. What, then, had happened to him? Was it that the shame and despair of the pillory still lingered in the bottom of his heart? That the lashes of his tormentor's whip reverberated unendingly in his soul, and that the sadness of such treatment had wholly extinguished in him even his passion for the bells? Or was it that Marie had a rival in the heart of the bell-ringer of Notre-Dame, and that the great bell and her 14 sisters were neglected for something more amiable and more beautiful? It chanced that, in the year of grace 1482, Annunciation Day fell on Tuesday, the 25th of March. That day the air was so pure and light that Quasimodo felt some returning affection for his bells. He therefore ascended the northern tower while the beadle below was opening wide the doors of the church, which were then enormous panels of stout wood covered with leather, bordered with nails of gilded iron, and framed in carvings very artistically elaborate. On arriving in the lofty bell-chamber, Quasimodo gazed for some time at the 6 bells and shook his head sadly, as though groaning over some foreign element which had interposed itself in his heart between them and him. But when he had set them to swinging, when he felt that cluster of bells moving under his hand, when he saw, for he did not hear it, the palpitating octave ascend and descend that sonorous scale, like a bird hopping from branch to branch, when the that demon who shakes a sparkling bundle of stret, trills, and arpeggios, had taken possession of the poor deaf man, he became happy once more. He forgot everything, and his heart expanding made his face beam. He went and came. He beat his hands together. He ran from rope to rope. He animated the 6 ringers with voice and gesture, like the leader of an orchestra who is urging on intelligent musicians. "Go on," said he, "go on, Gabriel. Pour out all thy noise into the place. 'Tis a festival today. No laziness, Theobald. Thou art relaxing. Go on, then. Art thou rusted, thou sluggard? That is well. Quick, quick, let not thy clapper be seen. Make them all deaf like me. That's it, Theobald. Bravely done. Giame, thou art the largest, and Pasquier in the smallest, and Pasquier does best. Let us wager that those who hear him will..." "Eli, what are you doing aloft there, you 2 sparrows? I do not see you making the least little shred of noise. What is the meaning of those beaks of copper which seem to be gaping when they should sing? Come, work now. 'Tis the feast of Annunciation. The sun is fine. The chime must be fine also. Poor Giame, thou art all out of breath, big fellow." He was wholly absorbed in spurring on his bells, all 6 of which vied with each other in leaping and shaking their shiny haunches, like a noisy team of Spanish mules, pricked on here and there by the apostrophes of the muleteer. All at once, on letting his glance fall between the large slate scales which covered the perpendicular wall of the bell tower at a certain height, he beheld on the square a young girl, fantastically dressed, stop, spread out on the ground a carpet, on which a small goat took up its post, and a group of spectators collect around her. This sight suddenly changed the course of his ideas and congealed his enthusiasm, as a breath of air congeals melted rosin. He halted, turned his back to the bells, and crouched down behind the projecting roof of slate, fixing upon the dancer that dreamy, sweet, and tender look which had already astonished the archdeacon on one occasion. Meanwhile, the forgotten bells died away abruptly and altogether, to the great disappointment of the lovers of bell-ringing, who were listening in good faith to the peal from above the Pont du Champs, and who went away dumbfounded, like a dog who had been offered a bone and given a stone. End of chapter 3. Okay, this chapter, short. Um, Quasimodo has not been ringing the bells lately, and people are like, well, mayhaps it's because of the pillory. Mayhaps it's because he was punished by being lashed for 2 hours in front of everybody. Mayhaps. Or maybe it's because he, has his eye on somebody else. I don't know. So he hasn't rung the bells in a very long time. And then the day comes, the day of Annunciation, and he's like, today's the day. It's a beautiful day. Let's go. And so he's ringing the bells, having a great time, like calling out their names and just living life. And the people around are enjoying it because they haven't heard it for so long. And they're like, oh, this is beautiful music. And he looks down and he sees La Esmeralda setting up, and so he stops. He stops playing, like dead in his tracks, and just looks down and just watches her. Like, like you do. Like one does. All right. Chapter 4. Ankh. It chanced that upon a fine morning in this same month of March, I think it was on Saturday the 29th, St. Eustace's Day, our young friend the student Gian Frollo du Moulin received, as he was dressing himself, that his breeches, which contained his purse, gave out no metallic ring. Poor purse, he said, drawing it from his fob. What? Not the smallest parisis? How cruelly the dice, beer-pots, and Venus have depleted thee! How empty, wrinkled, limp thou art! Thou resemblest the throat of a fury. I ask you, Messer Cicero and Messer Seneca, copies of whom, all dogs-eared, I behold scattered on the floor, what profits it me to know, better than any governor of the mint, or any Jew on the Pont aux Changes, that a golden crown stamped with a crown is worth 35 onzaines of 25 sous, and 8 deniers parisis apiece, and that a crown stamped with a crescent is worth 36 onzaines and 26 sous and 6 deniers tournois apiece. If I have not a single wretched black liard to risk on the double six, oh, Consul Cicero, this is no calamity from which one extricates oneself with paraphrases. Quemadmodum and verum enim vero. He dressed himself sadly. An idea had occurred to him as he laced his boots, but he rejected it at first. Nevertheless, it returned, and he put on his waistcoat wrong side out, an evident sign of violent internal combat. At last, he dashed his cap roughly on the floor and exclaimed, "So much the worse. Let come of it what may. I am going to my brother. I shall catch a sermon, but I shall catch a crown." Then he hastily donned his long jacket with furred half-sleeves, picked up his cap, and went out like a man driven to desperation. He descended the Rue de la Harpe towards the city. As he passed the Rue de la Huchette, the odor of those admirable spits, which were incessantly turning, tickled his olfactory apparatus, and he bestowed a a loving glance toward the Cyclopean roast, which one day drew from the Franciscan friar Cantiglione this pathetic exclamation, Veramente queste rotisserie sono coso stupenda. There is a footnote right here. Maybe it's a translation? It is. Truly, these roastings are a stupendous thing. What a thing to keep in Latin. What a wild phrase to still keep in Latin. But Jihan had not the wherewithal to buy a breakfast, and he plunged with a profound sigh under the gateway of the Petit Châtelet, that enormous double trefoil of massive towers which guarded the entrance to the city. He did not even take the trouble to cast a stone in passing, as was the usage, at the miserable statue of the Pyrénées Leclerc, who had delivered up the Paris of Charles VI to the English, a crime which his effigy, its face battered with stones and soiled with mud, expiated for 3 centuries at the corner of the Rue de la Harpe and the Rue de Buchy, as in an eternal pillory. The Petit Pont traversed the Rue Nouveau Sainte-Geneviève crossed. Jihan de Molendino found himself in front of Notre-Dame. Then indecision seized upon him once more, and he paced for several minutes round the statue of Monsieur Legree, repeating to himself with anguish, "The sermon is sure. The crown is doubtful." He stopped a beadle who emerged from the cloister. "Where is Monsieur the Archdeacon of Joseph?" "I believe that he is in secret cell in the tower," said the beadle. "I should advise you not to disturb him there, unless you come from some one like the Pope or Monsieur the King." Jiang clapped his hands. "Here's a magnificent chance to see the famous sorcery cell." This reflection having brought him to a decision, he plunged resolutely into the small black doorway, and began the ascent of the spiral of Saint Giles, which leads to the upper stories of the tower. "I am going to see," he said to himself on the way. "By the ravens of the Holy Virgin, it must needs be a curious thing, that cell which my reverend brother hides so secretly. 'Tis said that he lights up the kitchen of hell there, and that he cooks the philosopher's stone there over a hot fire. Bidieu, I care no more for the philosopher's stone than for a pebble, and I would rather find over his furnace an omelette of Easter eggs and bacon than the biggest philosopher's stone in the world." On arriving at the gallery of slender columns, he took breath for a moment, and swore against the interminable staircase by I know not how many million cartloads of devils. Then he resumed his ascent through the narrow door of the north tower, now closed to the public. Several moments after passing the bell chamber, he came upon a little landing place built in a lateral niche, and under the vault of a low, pointed door, whose enormous lock and strong iron bars he was enabled to see through a loophole pierced in the opposite circular wall of the staircase. Persons desirous of visiting this door at the present day will recognize it by this inscription engraved in white letters on the black wall: J'adore Coralie, 1823. Signe Eugene. Signe stands in the text. "Ugh," said the scholar, "'tis here, no doubt." The key was in the lock. The door was very close to him. He gave it a gentle push, and thrust his head through the opening. The reader cannot have failed to turn over the admirable works of Rembrandt, that Shakespeare of painting. Amid so many marvelous engravings, there is one etching in particular, which is supposed to represent Dr. Faust, and which it is impossible to contemplate without being dazzled. It represents a gloomy cell. In the center is a table loaded with hideous objects, skulls, spheres, alembics, compasses, hieroglyphic parchments. The doctor is before this table, clad in his large coat, and covered to the very eyebrows with his furred cap. He is visible only to his waist. He has half risen from his immense armchair, his clenched fists rest on the table, and he is gazing with curiosity and terror at a large luminous circle, formed of magic letters, which gleams from the wall beyond, like the solar spectrum in a dark chamber. This cabalistic sun seems to tremble before the eye and fills the wan cell with its mysterious radiance. It is horrible, and it is beautiful. Something very similar to Faust's cell presented itself to Jihan's view when he ventured his head through the half-open door. It also was a gloomy and sparsely lighted retreat. There also stood a large armchair and a large table, compasses, alembics, skeletons of animals suspended from the ceiling, a globe rolling on the floor, hippocephali mingled promiscuously with drinking cups, in which quivered leaves of gold, skulls placed upon vellum checkered with figures and characters, huge manuscripts piled up wide open, without mercy on the cracking corners of the parchment. In short, all the rubbish of science, and everywhere on this confusion dust and spider's web, but there was no circle of luminous letters, no doctor in an ecstasy contemplating the flaming vision as the eagle gazes upon the sun. Nevertheless, the cell was not deserted. A man was seated in the armchair and bending over the table. Jihan, to whom his back was turned, could see only his shoulders and the back of his skull, but he had no difficulty in recognizing that bald head which nature had provided with an eternal tonsure, as though desirous of marking by this external symbol the archdeacon's irresistible clerical vocation. Gian accordingly recognized his brother, but the door had been opened so softly that nothing warned Dom Claude of his presence. The inquisitive scholar took advantage of this circumstance to examine the cell for a few moments at his leisure. A large furnace, which he had not at first observed, stood to the left of the armchair beneath the window. The ray of light which penetrated through his aperture made its way through a spider's circular web, which tastefully inscribed its delicate rose in the arch of the window, and in the center of which the insect architect hung motionless, like the hub of this wheel of lace. Upon the furnace were accumulated in disorder all sorts of vases, earthenware, bottles, glass retorts, and mattresses of charcoal. Jihan observed, with a sigh, that there was no frying pan. How cold the kitchen utensils are, he said to himself. In fact, there was no fire in the furnace, and it seemed as though none had been lighted for a long time. A glass mask, which Jihan noticed among the utensils of alchemy, and which served, no doubt, to protect the archdeacon's face when he was working over some substance to be dreaded, lay in one corner covered with dust and apparently forgotten. Beside it lay a pair of bellows no less dusty, the upper side of which bore this inscription encrusted in copper letters: Spira, Spera. Other inscriptions were written, in accordance with the fashion of the heretics, in great numbers on the walls, some traced with ink, others engraved with a metal point. There were, moreover, Gothic letters, Hebrew letters, Greek letters, and Roman letters, pell-mell. The inscriptions overflowed at haphazard, on top of each other, the more recent effacing the more ancient, and all entangled with each other, like the branches in a thicket, like pikes in a fray. It was, in fact, a strangely confused mingling of all human philosophies, all reveries, all human wisdom. Here and there one shone out from among the rest like a banner among lance heads. Generally, it was a brief Greek or Roman device, such as the Middle Ages knew so well how to formulate. Unde, inde, homo homini monstrum, astra, castra, nonum, numen, sepier ad, fiat ubi volt, etc., etc. Sometimes a word devoid of all apparent sense, which possibly contained a bitter allusion to the regime of the cloister. Sometimes a simple maxim of clerical discipline formulated in a regular hexameter, Coelestem dominum terrestrum dicit dominum. There was also Hebrew jargon, of which Jihan, who as yet knew but little Greek, understood nothing, and all were traversed in every direction by stars, by figures of men or animals, and by intersecting triangles, and this contributed not a little to make the scrawled wall of the cell resemble a sheet of paper over which a monkey had drawn back and forth a pen filled with ink. The whole chamber, moreover, presented a general aspect of abandonment and dilapidation, and the bad state of the utensils induced the supposition that their power had long been distracted from his labors by other preoccupations. Meanwhile, this master, bent over a vast manuscript, ornamented with fantastical illustrations, appeared to be tormented by an idea which incessantly mingled with his meditations. That, at least, was Jihan's idea, when he heard him exclaim, with the thoughtful breaks of a dreamer thinking aloud. Yes, Manu said it, and Zoroaster taught it. The sun is born from fire, the moon from the sun. Fire is the soul of the universe. Its elementary atoms pour forth and flow incessantly upon the world through infinite channels. At the point where these currents intersect each other in the heavens, they produce light. At their point of intersection on earth, they produce gold. Light, gold, the same thing. From fire to the concrete state, the difference between the visible and the palpable, between the fluid and the solid in the same substance, between water and ice, nothing more. These are no dreams. It is the general law of nature. But what is one to do in order to extract from science the secret of this general law? What? This light which inundates my hand is gold. These same atoms dilated in accordance with a certain law need only be condensed in accordance with another law. How is it to be done? Some have fancied by burying a ray of sunlight. Averroes. Yes, 'tis Averroes. Averroes buried one under the first pillar of the left of the sanctuary of the Koran, in the great Mahometan mosque of Cordova, by the vault cannot be opened for the purpose of ascertaining whether the operation has succeeded until after the lapse of 8,000 years. The devil, said Jihan to himself, 'tis a long while to wait for a crown. Others have thought, continued the dreamy archdeacon, that it would be better worth while to operate upon a ray of Sirius. But 'tis exceedingly hard to obtain this ray pure, because of the simultaneous presence of other stars whose rays mingle with it. Flamel esteemed it more simple to operate upon terrestrial fire. Flamel, there's predestination in the name. Flamma, yes, fire, all lies there. The diamond is contained in the carbon, gold is in the fire, but how to extract it? Magistry affirms that there are certain feminine names which possesses a charm so sweet and mysterious that it suffices to pronounce them during this operation. Let us read what Manon says on the matter. Where women are honored, the divinities are rejoiced. Where they are despised, it is useless to pray to God. The mouth of a woman is constantly pure. It is a running water. It is a ray of sunlight. The name of a woman should be agreeable, sweet, fanciful. It should end in long vowels and resemble words of benediction. Yes, the sage is right. In truth, Maria, Sophia, La Esmeralda, damnation, always that thought. And he closed the book violently. He passed his hand over his brow, as though to brush away the idea which assailed him. Then he took from the table a nail and a small hammer, whose handle was curiously painted with cabalistic letters. For some time, he said with a bitter smile, I have failed in all my experiments. One fixed idea possesses me and sears my brain like fire. I have not even been able to discover the secret of Cassiodorus, whose lamp burned without wick and without oil. A simple matter, nevertheless. The deuce, muttered Jihan in his beard. Hence, continued the priest, one wretched thought is sufficient to render a man weak and beside himself. Oh, how Claude Purnell would laugh at me! She who could not turn Nicholas Flamel aside for one moment from his pursuit of great work. What? I hold in my hand the magic hammer of Zeichum. At every blow dealt by the formidable rabbi, from the depths of his cell upon this nail, that one of his enemies whom he had condemned, were he 1,000 leagues away, was buried a cubit deep in the earth which swallowed him. The King of France himself, in consequence of once having inconsiderately knocked at the door of the thaumaturgist, sank to the knees through the pavement of his own Paris. This took place 3 centuries ago. Well, I possess the hammer and the nail, and in my hands they are utensils no more formidable than a club in the hands of a maker of edge tools. And yet all that is required is to find the magic word which this Zychieli pronounced when he struck his nail. What nonsense, thought Jihan. Let us see. Let us try, resumed the Archdeacon briskly. Were I to succeed, I should behold the blue spark flash from the head of the nail. Amen Hatan. Amen Hatan. That is it. Sigyali. May this nail open the tomb to any one who bears the name of Phoebus. A curse upon it, always and eternally. The same idea. And he flung away the hammer in a rage. Then he sank down so deeply on the armchair and the table that Jihan lost him from view behind the great pile of manuscripts. For the space of several minutes all that he saw was his fist convulsively clenched on a book. Suddenly Dom Claude sprang up, seized a compass, and engraved in silence upon the wall in capital letters this Greek word. Ankh. My brother is mad, said Jihan to himself. It would have been far more simple to write Fatum. Everyone is not obliged to know Greek. The Archdeacon returned and seated himself in his armchair, and placed his head on both his hands, as a sick man does, whose head is heavy and burning. The student watched his brother with surprise. He did not know, he who wore his heart on his sleeve, he who observed only the good old law of nature in the world, he who allowed his passions to follow their inclinations, and in whom the lake of great emotions was always dry. So freely did he let it off each day by fresh drains. He did not know with what fury the sea of human passions ferments and boils when all egress is denied to it, how it accumulates, how it swells, how it overflows, how it hollows out the heart, how it breaks in inward sobs and dulls convulsions, until it has rent its dikes and burst its bed, the austere and glacial envelope of Claude Frollo. That cold surface of steep and inaccessible virtue had always deceived Jihan. The merry scholar had never dreamed that there was boiling lava, furious and profound, beneath the snowy brow of Etna. We do not know whether he suddenly became conscious of these things, but, giddy as he was, he understood that he had seen what he ought not to have seen, that he had just surprised the soul of his elder brother in one of its most secret altitudes, and that Claude must not be allowed to know it. Seeing that the Archdeacon had fallen back into his former immobility, he withdrew his head very softly, and made some noise with his feet outside the door, like a person who has just arrived and is giving warning of his approach. "Enter," cried the Archdeacon from the interior of his cell. "I was expecting you. I left the door unlocked expressly. Enter, Master Jacques." The scholar entered boldly. The Archdeacon, who was very much embarrassed by such a visit in such a place, trembled in his armchair. "What? 'Tis you, Jihan?" "'Tis a J, all the same," said the scholar, with his ready, merry, and audacious face. Dom Claude's visage had resumed its severe expression. "What are you come for?" "Brother," replied the scholar, making an effort to assume a decent, pitiful, and modest mien, and twirling his cap in his hands with an innocent air. I have come to ask of you, what? A little lecture of morality, of which I stand greatly in need. John did not dare to add aloud, and a little money, of which I am in still greater need. This last member of his phrase remained unuttered. Monsieur, said the archdeacon in a cold tone, I am greatly displeased with you. Alas, sighed the scholar. Dom Claude made his armchair, described a quarter circle, and gazed intently at Jehan. I'm very glad to see you. This was a formidable exordium. Jehan braced himself for a rough encounter. Jehan, complaints are brought me about you every day. What a fray was that in which you bruised with a cudgel a little Viscount Albert de Remonchamp? Oh, said Jehan, a vast little thing. A malicious page amused himself by splashing the scholars, by taking his horse gallop through the mire. Who, pursued the archdeacon, is that Mahiet Fargel, whose gown you have torn? Tunicam dishraverunt, saith the complaint. Ah, bah, a wretched cap of a Montague, isn't that? The complaint says tunicam and not capitum. Do you know Latin? John did not reply. Yes, pursued the priest, shaking his head, that is the state of learning and letters at the present day. The Latin tongue is hardly understood. Syriac is unknown. Greek, so odious that 'tis accounted no ignorance in the most learned to skip a Greek word without reading it, and to say, Gratium est non legitur. The scholar raised his eyes boldly. Monsieur, my brother, doth it please you that I shall explain in good French vernacular that Greek word which is written yonder on the wall? What word? Ankh. A slight flush spread over the cheeks of the priest with their high bones, like the puff of smoke which announces on the outside the secret commotions of a volcano. The student hardly noticed it. Well, Jehan, stammered the elder brother with an effort, what is the meaning of yonder word? Fate. Dom Claude turned pale again, and the scholar pursued carelessly. And that word below it, graved by the same hand, signifies impurity. You see that people do not know their Greek. And the archdeacon remained silent. This Greek lesson had rendered him thoughtful. Master Jehan, who possessed all the artful ways of a spoiled child, judged that the moment was a favorable one in which to risk his request. Accordingly, he assumed an extremely soft tone and began. My good brother, do you hate me to such a degree as to look savagely upon me because of a few mischievous cuffs and blows distributed in a fair war to a pack of lads and brats, equibustum marmosetis? You see, good brother Claude, that people know their Latin. But all this caressing hypocrisy did not have its usual effect on the severe elder brother. Cerberus did not bite at the honey cake. The archdeacon's brow did not lose a single wrinkle. What are you driving at? What are you driving at? He asked dryly. Well, in point of fact, this, replied Jehan bravely. I stand in need of money. At this audacious declaration, the archdeacon's visage assumed a thoroughly pedagogical and paternal expression. You know, Monsieur Jehan, that our fief of Tereshap, putting the direct taxes and the rents of the 29 houses in the block, yields only 39 livres, 11 sous, 6 deniers Parisian. It is 1/2 more than in the time of the brothers Piclet, but it is not much. I need money, said Jehan stoically. You know that the official has decided that our 21 houses should be moved full into the fief of the bishopric, and that we should redeem this homage only by paying the reverend bishop 2 marks of silver gilt of the price of 6 livres Parisian. Now, These two marks I have not yet been able to get together. You know it. I know that I stand in need of money, repeated Jihan for the third time. And what are you going to do with it? This question caused a flash of hope to gleam before Jihan's eyes. He resumed his dainty, caressing air. Stay, dear brother Claude. I should not have come to you with an evil motive. There is no intention of cutting a dash in the taverns with your unzanes, and of strutting about the streets of Paris in a comparison of gold brocade with a lackey, comme mieux la coisio. No, brother, 'tis for a good work. What good work? Demanded Claude, somewhat surprised. Two of my friends wish to purchase an outfit for the infant of a poor Haudriette widow. It is a charity. It will cost 3 florins, and I should like to contribute to it. What are the names of your 2 friends? Pierre Lossommier and Baptiste Croc-Orsine. Said the Archdeacon. Those are names as fit for a good work as a catapult for the chief altar. It is certain that Jihan had made a very bad choice of names for his 2 friends. He realized it too late. There is a footnote after the name of the 2 friends, and it is Peter the Slaughterer and Baptist Crack Gosling. And then, pursued the sagacious Claude, what sort of an infant's outfit is it that is to cost 3 florins, and that for the child of a Haudrette? Since when have widows taken to having babies in swaddling clothes? Jihan broke the ice once more. Ah, well, yes. I need money in order to go and see Isabeau tonight in the Val d'Amour. Impure wretch, exclaimed the priest. Impurity, said Jihan. This quotation, which the scholar borrowed with malice, perchance, from the wall of the cell, produced a singular effect on the Archdeacon. He bit his lips, and with wrath was drowned in a crimson flush. Begone, he said to Jihan. I am expecting someone. The scholar made one more effort. Brother Claude, give me at least 1 little parisis to buy something to eat. How far have you gone in the decretal of creation? Demanded Dom Claude. I have lost my copybooks. Where are you in your Latin humanities? My copy of Horace has been stolen. Where are you in Aristotle? Aye, faith. Brother, what father of the church is it who says that the errors of heretics have always had their lurking place in the thickets of Aristotle's metaphysics? A plague on Aristotle. I care not to tear my religion on his metaphysics. Young man, resumed the Archdeacon, at the king's last entry there was a young gentleman named Philippe de Comines, who wore embroidered on the housings of his horse this device, upon which I counsel you to meditate: Qui non laborat, non menducet. The scholar remained silent for a moment, with his fingers in his ear, his eyes on the ground, and a discomfited mien. All at once he turned round to Claude with the agile quickness of a wagtail. So, my good brother, you refuse me a sou Paris wherewith to buy a crust at a baker's shop. Qui non laborat, non menducet. At this response of the inflexible Archdeacon, Jihan hid his head in his hands, like a woman sobbing, and exclaimed with an expression of despair, "What is the meaning of this, sir?" demanded Claude, surprised at this freak. What indeed? Said the scholar, and he lifted to Claude his imprudent eyes, into which he had just thrust his fists, in order to communicate to them the redness of tears. "'Tis Greek. 'Tis an anapest of Aeschylus, which expresses grief perfectly." And here he burst into a laugh so droll and violent that it made the Archdeacon smile. It was Claude's fault, in fact. Why had he so spoiled that child? "Oh, good brother Claude," resumed Jihan, emboldened by his smile, "look at my worn-out boots. Is there a Cothernus in the world more tragic than these boots, whose soles are hanging out their tongues? The archdeacon promptly returned to his original severity. I will send you some new boots, but no money. Only a poor little priestess, brother, continued the suppliant, Jihan. I will learn Grecian by heart. I will believe firmly in God. I will be a regular Pythagoras of science and virtue. But one little Paresis, in mercy, would you have famine bite me with its jaws, which are gaping in front of me, blacker, deeper, and more noisome than a Tartarus, or the nose of a monk? Don Claude shook his wrinkled head. Qui non laborat. Gian did not allow him to finish. Well, he exclaimed, to the devil then. Long live joy. I will live in the tavern, I will fight, I will break pots, and I will go and see the wenches. And thereupon he hurled his cap at the wall and snapped his fingers like castanets. The archdeacon surveyed him with a gloomy air. Jihan, you have no soul. In that case, according to Epicurus, I lack a something made of another something which has no name. Jihan, you must think seriously of amending your ways. Oh, come now, cried the student, gazing in turn at his brother and the alembics on the furnace. Everything is preposterous here, both ideas and bottles. Jian, you are on a very slippery downward road. Do you know whither you are going? To the wine shop, said Jian. The wine shop leads to the pillory. 'Tis as good a lantern as any other, and perchance with that one Diogenes would have found this man. The pillory leads to the gallows. The gallows is a balance which has a man at one end and the whole earth at the other. 'Tis fine to be the man. The gallows leads to hell. 'Tis a big fire. Gian, the end will be bad. The beginning will have been good. At that moment the sound of a footstep was heard on the staircase. Silence, said the archdeacon, laying his finger on his mouth. Here is Master Jacques. Listen, Gian, he added in a low voice. Have a care never to speak of what you shall have seen or heard here. Hide yourself quickly under the furnace, and do not breathe. The scholar concealed himself. Just then a happy idea occurred to him. By the way, brother, Claude, a form for not breathing. Silence, I promise. You must give it to me. Take it, then, said the archdeacon angrily, flinging his purse at him. Gian darted under the furnace again, and the door opened. End of chapter 4. All right, so we are back with Claude's brother, and he is down on his luck. He's down on his luck. He's been just spending money left and right, gambling it, women, all these things, and so he doesn't have any money and he doesn't have any food. And he's like, you know what? Today I'm gonna go see Brother Claude and ask him for some money and maybe for a prayer. And so he goes there, or he goes to the church, and somebody outside is like, oh, he must be in his study. Like, I don't know if you want to see him. Like, he's pretty busy. Only 2 people are allowed up there. And so the brother is like, you know what? I'm going to go up there. The famed, mysterious room that he's always in. So he goes up there, and at first he goes very quietly so that Claude doesn't know that he's actually there. And he's just like looking around, and Claude is like muttering to himself. Definitely something that he doesn't want other people to know. And so Jihan's just like sitting there, like, or standing there, like he's doing something. And he's like, I'm just gonna observe. And so he's doing this, and Claude is obviously very upset, and he's going through and he's talking about like reading about like the virtue of women, and he's like, ah, yes, all virtuous women have a long vowel sound at the end. And he names a couple women, and he's about to say La Esmeralda, and he stops mid word and it's like, ah, this woman. And then he writes on the wall a couple Greek words, Ankh, and then something else. And then Gian makes his presence known, and he asks for money in like 4 different ways. And Claude's like, no, you're a sinner. You've sinned. I will give you boots. but I'm not going to give you any money because I know how you're going to spend it. But Jihan gives this like excuse of what he's going to do to spend the money, and it's all a lie, obviously. And Claude doesn't really fall for it. He's like, "Well, what are your friends' name? Why is this happening?" Like trying to poke holes in the story. And he's like, "I'm not going to give you any money." And they go back and forth, blah, blah, blah. And then we hear footsteps coming from outside of the room, and Claude is like, "Oh my gosh, it's Master Jacques. You need to hide. Hide behind this furnace, and don't you dare breathe a word of anything that you've heard here, and don't make your presence known." And Gian's like, "For a price." And then Claude's like, "Fine, fine." And then throws him like his purse. And that's where we ended. Getting all the characters that were just like sprinkled in for the first part of the book, and now they're like coming more and more solid, I guess, important. So that's cool. All right. What time is it? Oh, well, good. Let's see. All right. Chapter 5. The two men clothed in black. The personage who entered wore a black gown and a gloomy mane. The first point which struck the eye of our Jihan, who, as the reader will readily surmise, had ensconced himself in his nook in such a manner as to enable him to see and hear everything at his good pleasure, was the perfect sadness of the garments and the visage of his new corner. There was, nevertheless, some sweetness diffused over that face, but it was the sweetness of a cat or a judge, in affected, treacherous sweetness. He was very gray and wrinkled, and not far from his 60th year. His eyes blinked, his eyebrows were white, his lip pendulous, and his hands large. When Gian saw that it was only this, that is to say, no doubt a physician or a magistrate, and that this man had a nose very far from his mouth, a sign of stupidity, he nestled down in his hole, in despair at being obliged to pass an indefinite time in such an uncomfortable attitude, and in such bad company. The Archdeacon, in the meantime, had not even risen to receive his personage. He had made the latter a sign to seat himself on a stool near the door, and, after several moments of a silence which appeared to be a continuation of a preceding meditation, he said to him in a rather patronizing way, "Good day, Master Jacques." "Greetings, master," replied the man in black. There was in the two ways in which Master Jacques was pronounced on the one hand, and the master by preeminence of the other, the difference between Monseigneur and Monsieur, between Domine and Domne. It was evidently the meaning of a teacher and a disciple. "Well," resumed the Archdeacon after a fresh silence, which Master Jacques took good care not to disturb, "how are you succeeding?" "Alas, master," said the other, with a sad smile, "I am still seeking the stone. Plenty of ashes, but not a spark of gold." Dom Claude made a gesture of impatience. "I am not talking to you of that, Master Jacques Charmelot, but of the trial of your magician. Is it not Marc Senaine that you call him, the butler of the Court of Accounts? Does he confess his witchcraft? Have you been successful with the torture?" "Alas, no," replied Master Jacques, still with his sad smile. "We have not that consolation. That man is a stone. We might have him boiled in the Marché aux Pourceaux before he would say anything. Nevertheless, we are sparing nothing for the sake of getting at the truth. He is already thoroughly dislocated. We are applying all the herbs of St. John's Day, as saints of old comedians Plautus. Nothing answers. That man is terrible. I am at my wits' end over him." "You have found nothing new in his house?" "Ay, faith, yes," said Master Jacques, fumbling in his pouch. "This parchment. There are words in it which we cannot comprehend. The criminal advocate, Monseigneur Philippe Lieu, nevertheless knows a little Hebrew, which he learned in that matter of the Jews of the Rue Canterstein at Brussels. So saying, Master Jacques unrolled the parchment. "Give it here," said the Archdeacon, and casting his eyes upon this writing, "Pure magic, Master Jacques," he exclaimed. "'Tis the cry of the vampires when they arrive at the witches' sabbath, per ipsum et cum ipso et in ipso. 'Tis the command which chains the devil in the hex, hax, pax, max, that refers to medicine. A formula against the bite of mad dogs, Master Jacques. You are procurator to the king of the ecclesiastical courts. This parchment is abominable. We will put the man to the torture once more. Here again," added Master Jacques, fumbling afresh in his pouch, "is something that we have found at Marc Senane's house. It was a vessel belonging to the same family as those which covered Dom Claude's furnace." "Ah," said the Archdeacon, "a crucible for alchemy." "I will confess to you," continued Master Jacques with his timid and awkward smile, "that I have tried it over the furnace, but I have succeeded no better than you with my own." The Archdeacon began an examination of the vessel. "What has he engraved on his crucible? Och, och, the words which expels fleas, that Marc Senane is an ignoramus. I verily believe that you will never make gold with this. 'Tis good you set it in your bedroom in summer, and that is all." "Since we are talking about errors," said the king's procurator, "I have just been studying the figures on the portal below before ascending hither. Is your reverence quite sure that the opening of the work of physics is there portrayed on the side towards the Hôtel Dieu, and that among the 7 nude figures which stand at the feet of Notre-Dame, that which has wings on his heels of Mercurius?" "Yes," replied the priest, "'tis Augustin Nifo who writes it, that Italian doctor who had a bearded demon who acquainted him with all things. However, we will descend, and I will explain it to you with the text before us." "Thanks, master," said Jacques, bowing to the earth. "By the way, I was on the point of forgetting. When doth it please you that I shall apprehend the little sorceress?" "What sorceress?" "That Egyptian performer, you know, who comes every day to dance on the church square in spite of the official's prohibition. She hath a demonic goat with horns of the devil, which reads, which writes, which knows mathematics like Picatrix, and which would suffice to hang all Bohemia. The prosecution is all ready. 'Twill soon be finished, I assure you. A pretty creature, on my soul, that dancer. The handsomest black eyes. 2 Egyptian carbuncles. When shall we begin?" The Archdeacon was excessively pale. "I will tell you that hereafter," he stammered, in a voice that was barely articulate. Then he resumed with an effort. "Busy yourself with Mark." "Be at ease," said Jacques, with a smile. "I'll buckle him down again for you on the leather bed when I get home. But 'tis a devil of a man. He wearies even Perat Tortureux himself, who hath hands larger than my own, as that good Plautus saith, nudis victis centum podem pondo est quando pendes per pedis. The torture of the wheel and axle, 'tis the most effectual. He shall taste it." Dom Claude seemed absorbed in gloomy abstraction. He turned to Jacques. "Master Pierrot, Master Jacques, I mean, busy yourself with Mark." Yes, yes, Dom Claude, poor man. He will have suffered like Momol. What an idea to go to the witches' sabbath. A butler of the Court of Accounts, who ought to know Charlemagne's text, Striga vel masca, in the matter of the little girl. Smelarda, as they call her. I will await your orders. Ah, as we pass through the portal you will explain to me also the meaning of the gardener painted in relief, which one sees as one enters the church. Is it not the sower? Master, what of you? What are you thinking, pray?" Dom Claude, buried in his own thoughts, no longer listened to him. Jacques, following the direction of his glance, perceived that it was fixed mechanically on the great spider's web which draped the window. At that moment, a bewildered fly which was seeking the March sun flung itself through the net, and became entangled there. On the agitation of his web, the enormous spider made an abrupt move from his central cell, then, with one bound, rushed upon the fly, which he folded together with his four antennae, while his hideous proboscis dug into the victim's head. "Poor fly," said the king's procurator in the ecclesiastical court, and he raised his hand to save it. The archdeacon, as though roused with a start, withheld his arm with convulsive violence. "Master Jacques," he cried, "let fate take its course." The procurator wheeled round in affright. It seemed to him that pincers of iron had clutched his arm. The priest's eyes were staring, wild, flaming, and remained riveted on the horrible little group of the spider and the fly. "Oh, yes," continued the priest, in a voice which seemed to proceed from the depths of his being. "Behold, here a symbol of all. She flies, she is joyous, she is just born, she seeks the spring, the open air, liberty. Oh, yes. But let her come in contact with the fatal network, and the spider issues from it, the hideous spider. Poor dancer, poor, predestined fly. Let things take their course, Master Jacques. 'Tis faith. Alas, Claude, thou art the spider. Claude, thou art the fly also. Thou wert flying towards learning, light, the sun. Thou hadst no other care than to reach the open air, the full daylight of eternal truth. But in precipitating thyself towards the dazzling window which opens upon the other world, upon the world of brightness, intelligence, and science, blind fly, senseless, learned man, thou hast not perceived that subtle spider's web, stretched by destiny betwixt the light and thee. Thou hast flung thyself headlong into it, and now thou art struggling with head broken and mangled wings between the iron antennae of fate. Master Jacques, Master Jacques, let the spider work its will." "I assure you," said Jacques, who was gazing at him without comprehending, "that I will not touch it. But release my arm, master, for pity's sake. You have a hand like a pair of pincers." The archdeacon did not hear him. "Oh, madman," he went on, without removing his gaze from the window, "and even couldst thou have broken through that formidable web with thy gnat's wings, thou believest that thou couldst have reached the light? Alas, that pane of glass which is farther on, that transparent obstacle, that wall of crystal, harder than brass, which separates all philosophies from the truth, how wouldst thou have overcome it? O vanity of science, how many wise men come flying from afar to dash their heads against thee! How many systems vainly fling themselves, buzzing against the eternal pane!" He became silent. These last ideas, which had gradually led him back from himself to science, appeared to have calmed him. Jacques recalled him wholly to a sense of reality by addressing him this question. "Come now, master. When will you come to aid me in making gold? I am impatient to succeed." The archdeacon shook his head with a bitter smile. "Master Jacques, read Michel's Dialogus de Energia et Operatione Daemonum. What we are doing is not wholly innocent." "Speak lower, master. I have suspicion of it," said Jacques. "But one must practice a bit of hermetic science when one is only procurator of the king in the ecclesiastical court, at 30 crowns tournois a year. Only speak low." At that moment, the sound of jaws in the act of mastication, which proceeded from beneath the furnace, struck Jacques' uneasy ear. "What's that?" he inquired. It was the scholar who, ill at ease and greatly bored in his hiding-place, had succeeded in discovering there a stale crust and a triangle of mouldy cheese, and had set to devouring the whole without ceremony, by way of consolation and breakfast. As he was very hungry, he made a great deal of noise, and he accented each mouthful strongly, which startled and alarmed the procurator. "'Tis a cat of mine," said the archdeacon quickly, who was regaling herself under there with a mouse. This explanation satisfied Jacques. In fact, master, he replied with a respectful smile, all great philosophers have their familiar animal. You know what Servius saith, Nellis animum locis sin genio est, for there is no place that hath not its spirit. But Don Claude, who stood in terror of some new freak on the part of Jehan, reminded his worthy disciple that they had some figures on the facade to study together, and the two quitted the cell, to the accompaniment of a great oof from the scholar, who began to seriously fear that his knee would acquire the imprint of his chin. End of chapter 5. Okay. Chapter 5. Gian is hiding behind the furnace, listening, and he's situated himself so that he can listen and hear everything that's happening. And Jacques comes in and is giving like a report of his failures, basically. The things that he was supposed to be working on, the people that he was supposed to be torturing and getting answers from. It's not working. And so he's disappointed and sad that he has to say all of this. And Claude is just like asking him questions, blah, blah, blah. They're having a conversation. And then Jacques is like, so, like, when do you want me to, like, oust that performer? And Claude is like, what are you talking about? What performer? And he's like, you know the one. They call her Esmeralda or something like that. Like, we have all the papers. I could just, any day now, take her up. And then a fly comes in and gets caught in a web. And Claude, or no, the fly is, like, struggling and about to get eaten. And Jacques is going to rescue the little fly and is like, "Oh, you poor little fly!" And Claude stops him, like grabs his hand, like with little claws, is what I'm imagining, and stops him and is like, "Let nature work its course." And then he goes on this like tirade about how like and connects Esmeralda to this fly and Jacques to the fly and Claude to the fly and like the man to the fly and like all of these things, society to the fly, blah blah blah. This whole situation, you just need to let it play out is what we've got to. And Jacques is just trying to, make gold. He's just trying to make gold. He's trying to use alchemy to make gold. And Claude is like, "Yeah, it takes time, and by the way, you should know that like what we're doing isn't wholly innocent." And Jacques is like, "Yeah, I get it," which is so hypocritical. It's so hypocritical because they are like, the men of letters, the pious men, all of these things, and they're demonizing what Esmeralda is doing and her goat and like all of these things, and it's like, yeah, okay, we're great and everything, but like we need to dip into the dark arts just a little bit to make gold, which Esmeralda's not doing at all. She's just dancing. She's just dancing and singing and, teaching her goat fun little things to entertain people to get money. That's not demon. That's not demon work. However, this alchemy to make gold, definitely the work of demons. And yet here we are. But that's where we're going to end today. So, yes, thank you all so much for being here. As always, it is a pleasure. And as always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.